The morning sun broke through London's clouds as thousands lined the streets in silence. They stood shoulder to shoulder, many holding flowers or small flags, some wiping tears from their eyes. The mood was heavy but respectful, a nation saying goodbye to its queen. Captain James Harrington stood perfectly still near the entrance to Westminster Abbey. At 52, his red uniform fit him exactly as it had 20 years ago, every button polished to a mirror shine, every crease razor-sharp. Only the gray at his temples showed the passage of time. After 23 years in the Royal Guard, he had mastered the art of standing motionless for hours, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Today, those thoughts were stormy. As he watched the crowds gather outside the Abbey, Harrington felt the small weight in his pocket, a reminder of a promise made long ago, a promise he might never be able to keep. 2 minutes, whispered the commander beside him, barely moving his lips. Harrington gave the smallest nod in response, a movement so slight no onlooker would notice. The guards had perfected their own language of tiny gestures over centuries of standing still while needing to communicate. Inside the Abbey, world leaders and royalty from across the globe were taking their seats. The massive space, which had witnessed centuries of coronations and royal weddings, now prepared for its most solemn duty. The ancient stones seemed to hold their breath. A light breeze carried the scent of thousands of flowers piled around the palace and abbey. The public had been bringing them for days along with handwritten notes and children's drawings. Harrington had walked past the growing memorial each morning on his way to duty, watching it spread like a colorful garden of grief and respect. The church bells began to toll, deep and resonant, rolling across the city. Harrington took one last, deep breath and settled into the state of alert stillness that royal guards were famous for. His face became a mask, showing nothing, revealing nothing. The massive doors of Westminster Abbey opened. The guard formation straightened imperceptibly, though they had already been standing at perfect attention. This was it. The Queen's final journey was beginning. The coffin appeared, carried by 8 guardsmen who moved with slow, deliberate steps. The royal standard draped over it was bright against the somber backdrop, the crown jewels glittering on top. Harrington felt a tightness in his throat but kept his expression neutral. Guards did not show emotion on duty. It was the first rule, the most important one. As the procession passed him, Harrington executed a perfect salute. His movements were mechanical, practiced thousands of times, but the feeling behind them was anything but mechanical. This was for her, the woman who had been his commander-in-chief for his entire military career. The crowd outside fell completely silent as the coffin passed. Some bowed their heads, others placed hands over hearts. A few wept openly, but most stood in dignified silence, united in this moment of national mourning. The procession moved with glacial slowness, each step measured and synchronized. The pallbearers' faces showed the strain of their burden, not just the physical weight but the emotional significance of what they carried. Harrington and his unit fell into formation behind the royal family. From his position, he could see the straight backs of the princes, the Queen's grandchildren, their faces set in stone as they walked behind their grandmother's coffin. He had watched them grow up from a distance, standing guard at their birthdays, their school celebrations, their weddings. Now he guarded their grief. Inside the abbey, the light filtered through stained glass windows, casting colored patterns across the stone floor. The space was filled with the soft sounds of 500 guests finding their places, the occasional cough or whisper echoing in the vaulted ceiling. Harrington took his position near the altar, his eyes fixed forward, seeing everything while appearing to look at nothing. It was a skill all guards developed, total awareness while maintaining perfect stillness. The archbishop appeared in his ceremonial robes, prayer book in hand. The choir arranged themselves in their places, their red and white garments bright against the dark wood of the choir stalls, and then music filled the space. The organ first, low and resonant, then voices rising in harmony, singing a hymn the Queen herself had chosen for this day. The sound wrapped around the congregation like a blanket, at once sorrowful and uplifting. Harrington had been to dozens of state funerals over his career. He knew the routine by heart, the prayers, the readings, the moments of silence. But knowledge didn't make it easier. If anything, it made it harder. He knew exactly what was coming, each step bringing them closer to the final goodbye. The royal family sat in the front row, their profiles visible from Harrington's position. They were practiced at public grief, having lived their entire lives in the spotlight. But today, even they seemed more vulnerable, more human. The Queen had been not just their sovereign, but their mother, grandmother, great-grandmother. As the service continued, Harrington maintained his stance. Guards were trained to stand motionless for hours, managing discomfort through mental discipline. His legs had begun to ache, but he pushed the sensation away, focusing instead on the Archbishop's words about duty and service. Duty and service. Those words had defined the Queen's life. They defined Harrington's too. Sometimes he wondered if people outside the military or royal household truly understood what those words meant. The daily sacrifices, large and small, the putting aside of personal comfort for something larger than yourself. The sun shifted, sending new patterns of colored light across the floor as the service continued. Harrington's mind drifted briefly to his first day in the Royal Guard. How nervous he had been, how desperate to prove himself worthy. His commanding officer had told him something he never forgot. You don't just protect the royals with your body. You protect the idea of continuity, of tradition. In a changing world, you represent permanence. Now, watching the Queen's funeral, those words took on new meaning. The woman was gone, but the crown continued. That was the point of all this ceremony, to show that while monarchs may die, the monarchy endured. A soloist began to sing, her clear voice rising to the rafters. Several people in the congregation dabbed at their eyes. Even one of the younger royals seemed to be fighting back tears, but not Harrington, not while on duty. Through the massive doors of the abbey, he could see a slice of the crowd outside, watching on large screens set up along the procession route. Ordinary people who had camped out overnight to be here, to be part of history. Their devotion moved him, though his face showed nothing. The small weight in his pocket seemed to grow heavier as the service progressed. Harrington resisted the urge to reach for it, to feel its familiar shape in his hand. 20 years he had carried it. 20 years of waiting for the right moment to return it as she had asked. Now that moment would never come. Or would it? The thought came to him suddenly, unwelcome and impossible. He pushed it away immediately. Such a thing couldn't be done. It would violate every rule, every tradition he had spent his life upholding. The Archbishop stepped forward for the final blessing. This was the moment Harrington had been dreading most. Soon the coffin would be taken from the abbey to its final resting place. His long association with the Queen would end, becoming just memories and stories to tell younger guards in the barracks late at night. As the blessing finished, the congregation rose as one. The pallbearers approached the coffin once more. Harrington felt the object in his pocket, small and round and heavy with meaning. His hand twitched slightly, wanting to reach for it, but he controlled the impulse. Not now. Not yet. The Queen's final journey out of Westminster Abbey began, the coffin moving down the aisle with the same measured pace as before. Harrington watched it pass, his eyes forward, his posture perfect. No one looking at him would know the storm of emotions behind his practiced calm. No one would know what he carried, both in his pocket and in his heart. No one would guess what he was considering, what promise remained unfulfilled. No one would imagine that Captain James Harrington, the most rule-following, protocol-obsessed officer in the Royal Guard, was thinking about breaking the most sacred rule of all. But that would come later. For now he did his duty, standing guard as his Queen passed by him one final time. As the procession moved slowly toward the doors, Harrington's mind returned to a hospital room 20 years earlier, to a conversation that had changed his life, to a promise made to a Queen who had, for one brief hour, been simply a kind woman sitting beside his bed, talking about poetry and courage and the things that matter most when everything else is stripped away. The weight in his pocket wasn't just metal, it was memory, promise, connection. And as the doors of Westminster Abbey prepared to close behind the Queen's coffin, Captain James Harrington made a decision that would soon move an entire nation to tears. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beeping of machines. 20 years earlier, Lieutenant James Harrington lay in a military hospital bed, his body broken from a training accident gone terribly wrong. 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, internal bleeding. The doctors had told him he was lucky to be alive. Pain medication made the world fuzzy around the edges. Harrington drifted in and out of sleep, marking time by the nurse's rounds and the changing light through the window. His unit had sent flowers. His parents had visited, his mother crying. His father, a former soldier himself, standing stoic but with worry etched across his face. On the 5th day after the accident, Harrington woke to unusual activity in the hallway outside his room. Voices murmured, footsteps hurried back and forth. He tried to sit up straighter, wincing as pain shot through his chest. The door opened, and a nurse poked her head in. "Lieutenant Harrington, are you up for a visitor?" Before he could ask who would be visiting, the door opened wider. 2 men in dark suits stepped in, scanning the room with practiced efficiency, and then, impossibly, the Queen walked in. Not the distant figure he had seen in parades and on television, but the actual Queen in a simple blue dress and pearls, standing at the foot of his hospital bed. Harrington tried to sit up again, forgetting, for a moment, about his injuries. "Your Majesty," he gasped, both from surprise and pain. "Please, don't move on my account," she said, her voice gentle but firm. She glanced at a chair beside the bed. "May I?" One of the suited men moved quickly to position the chair for her. Harrington couldn't believe what was happening. The Queen was visiting him, a junior officer no one had ever heard of. "Lieutenant Harrington," she said, consulting a small card. In her hand, "I'm told you saved 2 of your men in the accident." His mind flashed back to the training exercise, the sudden crack of metal giving way, the shouts, the instinctive lunge to push his men clear as the equipment collapsed. "I just reacted, Your Majesty," he said. "Anyone would have done the same." She smiled slightly. "I think we both know that's not true." She set the card down. "I'm visiting the hospital today to thank our servicemen and women. When the doctors told me about your actions, I wanted to speak with you personally." What followed was the most surreal 30 minutes of Harrington's life. The Queen of England sat beside his bed and asked about his family, where he had grown up, how long he had been in service. The questions weren't just polite formalities. She listened to his answers, asked follow-up questions, remembered details he mentioned earlier in the conversation. "My father was in the Royal Artillery during the war," Harrington told her. "He always said his proudest moment was when you and your sister visited the troops as teenagers." "We were so young then," she said, a distant look in her eyes. "But Father insisted we understand what our men were sacrificing, that we weren't above the war effort but part of it." The conversation shifted to his recovery, his plans after the hospital. Harrington found himself talking more openly than he'd intended, perhaps because of the pain medication, perhaps because there was something in her manner that invited confidence. "I write a bit," he admitted when she asked what he did in his free time. "Nothing special, just poems mostly." "Poetry?" She looked genuinely interested. "What sort of poetry does a lieutenant write?" Embarrassment warmed his face. "Just observations, really, about military life, the places I've served, sometimes just about the weather or the birds outside my window." He hesitated. "My father says it's a waste of time." "Your father is wrong," she said simply. "Words matter. They're how we make sense of the world, especially the difficult parts." A nurse appeared at the door, tapping her watch discreetly. The royal visit had a strict schedule. "Just a moment more," the Queen said, and the nurse nodded, backing out of the room. She turned to Harrington again. Do you keep your poems somewhere? In a notebook, it's in my belongings. He nodded toward a small cabinet beside the bed. To his surprise, she stood and walked to the cabinet. May I? When he nodded, she opened the drawer and found a worn green notebook. She didn't open it, just held it thoughtfully in her hands. My father wrote poetry too, she said. During the war. He said it kept him sane when the bombs were falling on London. She placed the notebook carefully on the table beside his bed. Perhaps you'll let me read some of yours someday. It wasn't a command, but coming from the Queen, even a suggestion, carried weight. Of course, Your Majesty, though they're not very good. I suspect you're too hard on yourself, Lieutenant. She reached into her handbag, a simple black one, not the formal purse he would later see her carry at state events. From it, she withdrew a small medallion, about the size of a large coin but thicker. This belonged to my father, she said, turning it over in her hand. The medallion caught the light, revealing an intricate design on one side. He carried it through the entire war, said it was his good luck charm. She studied it for a moment longer, then held it out to him. He gave it to me during a difficult time in my life, and it brought me comfort. Perhaps it will do the same for you during your recovery. Harrington was stunned. Your Majesty, I couldn't possibly. Take it, she said firmly, placing it in his hand. Consider it a loan if that makes it easier. When you no longer need its strength, you can return it to me. His fingers closed around the medallion. It was heavier than it looked, the metal warm from her hand. Thank you, he said, the words utterly inadequate for what he was feeling. I'll keep it safe until I can return it. She smiled. I know you will. She stood to leave, then paused. Write while you recover, Lieutenant. The best poetry comes from moments when we see life most clearly. After she left, Harrington lay in the hospital bed, the medallion clutched in his hand, wondering if he had hallucinated the entire visit. But the medallion was real, solid, and warm against his palm. So was the memory of her interest in his writing, her quiet words of encouragement. In the days and weeks that followed, as his body slowly healed, Harrington wrote more than he ever had before. Poems about pain and recovery, about the strange beauty of hospital light through curtains, about duty and sacrifice, about a queen who took time to sit with an injured soldier. He kept the medallion with him constantly. At first, he examined it often, the profile of the old king on one side, a simple pattern of oak leaves on the other. But soon it became something he didn't need to look at to know was there. A talisman. A reminder that he had been seen, truly seen, by someone whose life couldn't have been more different from his own. When he finally left the hospital, the medallion went with him. Through physical therapy, through his return to active duty, through deployments and training and the ordinary days of military life. 5 years after the hospital visit, Harrington achieved his lifelong dream, acceptance into the Royal Guard. The training was grueling, the standards impossibly high. On days when he thought he couldn't continue, he would hold the medallion in his hand and remember her words. When you no longer need its strength, you can return it to me. He wasn't ready to return it yet. He still needed its strength. Years passed. Harrington rose through the ranks. Lieutenant became captain. The young soldier became a respected officer. He guarded the Queen at countless ceremonies, standing at perfect attention as she passed by. Sometimes he thought he saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes, but he couldn't be sure. She met thousands of people every year. Why would she remember one lieutenant from a hospital visit decades ago? Still, he kept writing poetry, and he kept the medallion with him always, waiting for the right moment to return it as promised. During garden parties when she walked near the guards, during palace ceremonies when she passed within arm's reach, during state dinners when he stood behind her chair. But the moment never seemed right. There were always too many people, too much formality, too great a distance between a guard and his queen. And now, 20 years after that hospital room conversation, Captain James Harrington stood watch at her funeral, the medallion still in his pocket, the promise still unfulfilled. Through the solemn ceremony, as prayers were said and hymns were sung, memories of that hospital visit played through his mind. Her kindness to a young soldier, her interest in his poetry, the way she had seen the person behind the uniform. The medallion had been a loan, not a gift. "When you no longer need its strength, you can return it to me," she had said. Harrington's hand moved slightly toward his pocket, feeling the familiar shape through the fabric. The truth was, he didn't need its strength anymore. He had found his own, through years of service, through discipline, through the writing that had become more than just a hobby. He was ready to return it. But now it was too late. Or was it? As the Archbishop's voice echoed through Westminster Abbey, a wild, impossible thought began to form in Captain Harrington's mind. The Archbishop's voice echoed through Westminster Abbey as he spoke about the Queen's life of service. His words painted a picture of a woman who had given everything to her country, who had put duty above personal comfort for more than 70 years. Captain James Harrington stood motionless, his face showing nothing. But inside, a storm was brewing. The medallion in his pocket seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute. 20 years he had carried it. 20 years of waiting for the right moment to return it, as she had asked. Now that moment would never come, unless he created it himself. Harrington's eyes moved slightly, taking in the scene around him without turning his head. The royal family sat in the front row, their grief visible despite their practiced composure. World leaders filled the pews behind them. Cameras broadcasted every moment to billions of people worldwide. And there he stood, one guard among many, invisible in his visibility, a background figure in a historic moment. Except he wasn't just a background figure. Not really. Not with what he knew, what he carried, what he remembered. The choir began to sing, their voices rising toward the vaulted ceiling. The melody was one the Queen had personally selected for her funeral, a fact Harrington had learned during the planning meetings in the weeks before. Even in death, she had thought of everything, controlled everything, except this one small thing. This one small object that had traveled from her father's pocket to hers, from her hand to Harrington's, and now waited to complete its journey. His mind drifted back to that hospital room 20 years ago. He had been barely conscious. Tubes running from his arms, pain medication making the world fuzzy around the edges. The doctors had told him he was lucky to be alive after the training accident. 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, internal bleeding. He remembered the list of injuries better than he remembered the accident itself. He had been drifting in and out of sleep when the door opened. At first he thought it was another nurse coming to check his vitals. Then he heard the distinctive murmur of security personnel, and his soldier's instincts pulled him to full alertness despite the medication. And there she was, the Queen, standing at the foot of his bed, looking at him not with the formal expression he had seen in photographs and formal events, but with genuine concern. "Lieutenant Harrington," she had said, reading his name from the chart. "They tell me you saved 2 of your men." He had tried to sit up straighter, forgetting for a moment that you don't sit up for the Queen when you have a chest tube. Pain shot through his side and he winced. "Please don't move on my account," she had said, pulling a chair closer to his bed. "I've come to thank you, not to cause you more discomfort." What followed was the most surreal conversation of his life. She asked about his family, his hometown in northern England, how long he had been in service. He told her about his grandfather who had served in World War II, about his dream of joining the Royal Guard someday, about the poetry he wrote in the small notebook he kept in his pocket. "Poetry?" she had said, seeming genuinely surprised. "What sort of poetry does a lieutenant write?" He had been embarrassed, but something about her interest seemed genuine. He told her about his poems, observations about military life, about the changing seasons in the places he had been stationed, about the strange beauty he sometimes found in difficult moments. "I'd like to read them someday," she had said, and he couldn't tell if it was just politeness or genuine interest. Either way, it felt like a royal command. Before she left, she had reached into her handbag, a simple black one, not the formal purse he would later see her carry at state events. From it, She withdrew a small medallion, about the size of a large coin but thicker, with an intricate design on one side. "This belonged to my father," she said, placing it in his hand. "He carried it through the Second World War. He gave it to me during a difficult time in my life, and it brought me comfort. Perhaps it will do the same for you during your recovery." Harrington had been speechless, trying to refuse such a personal gift, but she closed his fingers around it. "When you no longer need its strength," she had said, "you can return it to me." Now standing in the Abbey as her funeral service continued, Harrington realized he had never found the right moment to return it. There had been opportunities over the years, ceremonies where he stood guard, occasions where she passed, close enough that he could have spoken if it hadn't been a severe breach of protocol. But each time something held him back. First, it was that he still needed the strength the medallion represented. Later, he worried about embarrassing her with such a personal matter in a public setting. Eventually, it became easier to keep carrying it, a secret connection between himself and the monarch he served. The choir finished their hymn and a relative of the Queen approached the lectern to give a reading. Time was running out. Soon the coffin would be moved to the royal vault at Windsor. The medallion would go with him to his grave, a promise unfulfilled unless he acted now. But the rules were absolute. The protocol that governed royal ceremonies was not merely tradition, it was the backbone of the institution itself. To break it was to undermine everything the monarchy represented. As a royal guard, Harrington had sworn to uphold that protocol, to be the living embodiment of discipline and tradition. Breaking formation during a royal funeral was unthinkable. Guards had been dismissed for less. His entire career, his pension, his place in the guard community, all would be forfeit. The media would have a field day. He would become the guard who ruined the Queen's funeral, his motivations questioned, his character attacked. Harrington's gaze fell on the crown resting atop the coffin, the symbol of authority, of continuity. What would she want? The woman who had followed protocol her entire life, who had put duty above personal feeling time and again. Would she want him to disrupt her funeral for the sake of a promise made 2 decades ago? But then he remembered her eyes in that hospital room. The way she had spoken to him not as a queen to a subject, but as one person to another. The personal history of the medallion she had shared. That hadn't been protocol. That had been human connection. Something real amid the formal structures that governed both their lives. The reading ended. The Archbishop returned to lead prayers. Harrington could feel sweat forming under his heavy uniform despite the Abbey's cool interior. His hand twitched slightly, feeling the outline of the medallion through the fabric of his pocket. He thought of his fellow guards, how they would look at him afterward. Some would understand once they knew the story. Others would never forgive. The breach of discipline. The Guard Corps prided itself on perfect performance, on being the gold standard for military ceremony worldwide. His actions would place a black mark on that record, but some promises transcended duty. Some connections mattered more than rules. Harrington watched as the pallbearers prepared to lift the coffin. This was his last chance. In moments, they would begin the procession out of the Abbey, and the Queen would be gone forever. He thought of the news headlines that would follow, the social media frenzy, the official inquiry that would certainly end his career. 23 years of service, finished in one moment of what would look to the world like madness or disrespect. Could he live with that? Could he live with being the guard who broke protocol at the Queen's funeral? More importantly, could he live with not keeping his promise? With letting her go without returning what had once been precious to her father, then to her, and finally to him? The decision crystallized in his mind as the Archbishop spoke the final blessing. Harrington had spent his life following rules, honoring tradition, putting duty first. Perhaps in this one moment, the greatest duty was to the human connection that had existed between a wounded soldier and a compassionate queen. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. His fingers closed around the medallion in his pocket. He had less than a minute to act before the coffin would be lifted. Whatever he decided now would define the rest of his life. The pallbearers took their positions, 6 royal guards in perfect formation, preparing for the final journey. Harrington looked at their faces. young men he had trained himself, who looked to him as an example of what a guard should be. What example did he want to set? Perfect adherence to protocol? Or perfect fulfillment of a personal promise? The Archbishop stepped back. The pallbearers bent to lift the coffin. The moment of decision had arrived. In that split second, Captain James Harrington, decorated officer of the Royal Guard, made the choice that would soon move an entire nation to tears. Time seemed to slow as Captain James Harrington watched the pallbearers prepare to lift the Queen's coffin. The final prayers had been said. The choir's last note still hung in the air. In moments they would carry her away, and his chance would be gone forever. 23 years in the Royal Guard had taught Harrington's body to move only when commanded, to remain perfectly still through discomfort, exhaustion, and even danger. This discipline was so deeply ingrained that breaking it felt almost physically impossible, as if his muscles would refuse the command from his brain. But his hand was already moving toward his pocket. The decision, once made, carried him forward, like a river current. He stepped out of formation. The movement was so unexpected, so unprecedented that for a split second no one reacted. Then came the ripple of shock through Westminster Abbey, a collective intake of breath from those close enough to see what was happening. One of the other guards glanced at him, eyes widening in alarm. Security personnel stationed throughout. The Abbey shifted their positions slightly, hands moving toward earpieces. In the front row, members of the royal family turned to look. Harrington was breaking the most fundamental rule of royal ceremony, that guards remain invisible, part of the pageantry but never its focus. Now, suddenly, he had made himself the center of attention at the most solemn royal event in decades. His steps were measured, deliberate. The same disciplined pace he had used in countless parades and ceremonies, but now directed toward a purpose no training had ever covered. He approached the coffin with his back straight, his chin up, every inch the Royal Guard except for the fact that he was terribly, catastrophically out of place. From the corner of his eye, he could see a security officer starting to move toward him. One of his fellow guard commanders was half turning, clearly torn between stopping Harrington and maintaining his own position. The Abbey's head of security, seated near the back, was already on his feet. They would reach him in seconds. Whatever he was going to do, he had to do it now. Harrington reached the coffin and came to attention beside it. With military precision, he executed a perfect salute, the slow, deliberate movement reserved for moments of highest ceremony. His white glove touched the brim of his tall bearskin hat, then returned sharply to his side. The cameras broadcasting the funeral to millions worldwide were now all focused on him. Tomorrow, his face would be on every newspaper front page, his name mentioned in living rooms across the globe. But in this moment, none of that existed for Harrington. There was only his promise, and the woman to whom he had made it. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the medallion. It caught the light streaming through the Abbey's stained glass windows, gleaming gold against the red of his uniform. Small but unmistakable, it had been his secret companion through decades of service. Harrington held it for a moment, looking at it one last time. Then, with gentle reverence, he placed it atop the royal standard draping the coffin, just beside the crown. The medallion looked tiny there, a personal token amid the grandeur of state regalia. But it belonged with her, just as she had said it would when the time was right. Harrington leaned forward slightly. His lips moved, forming words, too quiet for even the closest observers to hear. "Thank you for the strength, Your Majesty. I don't need it anymore." He stepped back, saluted once more, and then, surprising everyone who thought the protocol breach couldn't possibly become more dramatic, he bowed deeply from the waist. It was not a military movement, but a personal gesture of respect, the kind a subject might offer their queen in a private audience rather than a state occasion. When he straightened, Harrington's face remained composed, but those nearest could see something they had never witnessed in his 23 years of service. A single tear tracking down his weathered cheek. He turned with military sharpness and began walking back to his position. The entire sequence had taken less than 30 seconds. By now, security personnel were converging from several directions. The head of royal protection was speaking urgently into his communication device. Harrington could see his commanding officer's face, a mixture of shock, anger, and something that might have been grudging respect. The other guards remained at attention, faces forward, but their eyes followed him. In those looks, Harrington could read their thoughts clearly. Had he lost his mind? Was this some kind of protest, a security threat, or simply the actions of a man overcome by grief? None of them knew yet about the hospital room, the conversation, the promise. None of them understood that what looked like a shocking breach of protocol was actually the fulfillment of a duty far more personal than standing guard. As he neared his position, 2 security officers intercepted him. They didn't grab him. No one would dare manhandle a royal guard in full ceremonial uniform during a state funeral, but they positioned themselves on either side, clearly prepared to remove him if necessary. "Captain Harrington," one said, quietly, "you need to come with us." Harrington nodded once. He had expected this. But before he could step away, a voice spoke from the front row. Wait. It was the new king, the Queen's son. He had half risen from his seat, breaking royal protocol, himself in this unprecedented moment. With a small gesture, he indicated that the security officers should stay where they were. For a heartbeat, the funeral seemed frozen in a tableau of confusion. The security officers unsure whether to follow the king's command or continue with standard threat response. The clergy waiting to proceed with the ceremony. The other guards still at attention but watching with peripheral vision. The king looked directly at Harrington, then at the medallion now resting on his mother's coffin. Something like recognition flickered across his face. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then resumed his seat. The security officers exchanged glances, then stepped back, allowing Harrington to return to his position in the guard formation. He did so with the same measured steps, resuming his stance as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. In that brief interaction, witnessed by billions, something unprecedented had occurred. A breaking of barriers between the strictly formal and the deeply personal aspects of royal life. The pallbearers, who had paused during the interruption, now moved forward again. They lifted the coffin with the medallion still in place atop it. Whatever would happen to Harrington after the ceremony was over, his token would remain with the Queen on her final journey. As the procession began moving toward the doors of Westminster Abbey, whispers rippled through the congregation. Who was that guard? What had he placed on the coffin? Why had the king allowed it? Cameras that had been focused on the coffin and royal family now caught glimpses of Harrington as he fell into formation behind the procession. His face had returned to its professional mask, but there was something different about him now, a sense of peace that hadn't been there before. Outside the abbey, the crowds watching on large screens had seen everything. Social media was already exploding with video clips, questions, theories. Who was this guard who had dared to break centuries of protocol? Was he a protester? A devoted royalist? Someone with a personal connection to the Queen? Within the hour, journalists would be digging into Harrington's background. By evening, the hospital story would emerge. But for now, as the funeral procession moved through London's streets, he was simply the guard who had done the unthinkable, and somehow been allowed to remain in formation. Harrington marched in perfect step with his unit, eyes forward, back straight. His career was likely over. He would face an inquiry, possibly disciplinary action. His reputation within the Guard Corps would be forever changed. And yet, as the procession continued under the gray London sky, Harrington felt lighter than he had in years. The weight in his pocket was gone. The promise was kept. Whatever came next, the questions, the consequences, the judgment of his peers, he would face it, knowing he had done what was right, not what protocol demanded, not what tradition expected, but what the human connection between a queen and a young soldier had required. Behind him, on the coffin, the small medallion caught the occasional flash of sunlight breaking through the clouds, a personal token amid the pomp of a state funeral, carrying its own quiet story through the streets of London. By evening, Captain James Harrington's face was on every news channel in Britain. The moment he stepped out of formation had been captured from multiple angles, shared millions of times, and was already being called the medallion moment across social media platforms. Harrington himself sat in a small room at the Royal Guard headquarters, his ceremonial uniform replaced by simple civilian clothes. His hat and sword had been taken, standard procedure when a guard was under review. 3 senior officers sat across from him, their faces stern as they concluded his initial debriefing. "You understand the seriousness of your actions today?" said the most senior officer, not a question but a statement. Harrington nodded. "Yes, sir. In all my 30 years with the Guard, I have never seen such a breach of protocol during a state ceremony," the officer continued. "The inquiry will begin tomorrow. Until then, you are relieved of duty." As Harrington left the building through a side entrance, he was surprised to find a small crowd of reporters waiting. News traveled fast in the digital age, especially news as unprecedented as his. "Captain Harrington, why did you approach the Queen's coffin? What was the object you placed there? Do you regret breaking protocol?" Harrington kept his head down and pushed through without answering. A car was waiting, not a military vehicle but a plain black sedan with tinted windows. The driver opened the door without a word, and Harrington slipped inside, grateful for the escape. Only when the car pulled away did he notice he wasn't alone. A man in a dark suit sat opposite him, his posture impeccable, his expression unreadable. "Captain Harrington," the man said, "I'm Richard Wells, private secretary to the King. His Majesty would like a word." Harrington's stomach tightened. A private audience with the King after what he'd done could only mean one thing. His disgrace would be complete and personal. The car wound through London streets as dusk settled over the city. Crowds still lined areas near the funeral route, leaving flowers and remembrances. On one corner, Harrington noticed something strange. A small group of people holding what appeared to be replicas of his medallion. Wells followed his gaze. "Ah, yes," he said. "Those have been appearing since about 2 hours ago, when the hospital story broke." "Hospital story?" Harrington asked. "A nurse who was present during Her Majesty's visit 20 years ago recognized you from the footage. She spoke to the BBC. The story went viral immediately." Harrington closed his eyes briefly. Of course, there had been medical staff in the room that day. Someone was bound to remember. The car turned into a private entrance to the palace. Guards who would normally have stopped and checked every vehicle waved them through with quick salutes. Even in his disgrace, Harrington noted, the uniform still commanded respect. He was led through corridors he knew well from his service, but now he walked them as neither guard nor visitor, something in between, a man whose status had become as unclear as his future. The room where the King waited was small by palace standards, a private study rather than a formal reception room. The monarch stood as Harrington entered, a gesture that immediately set this meeting apart from official protocol. "Captain Harrington," the King said, motioning to a chair. "Please sit." Harrington remained standing. "With respect, Your Majesty, I'll stand. I'm still a royal guard until the inquiry formally dismisses me." The King studied him for a moment, then nodded. "The medallion you placed on my mother's coffin today, I recognized it." This surprised Harrington. "You did, sir?" "My grandfather gave it to her during the war. I remember her showing it to me when I was a boy." The King walked to a side table where a folder lay open. "After what happened today, I had the palace archivist search her personal journals. She mentioned you." He picked up a page and read, "Visited military hospital today. Met a young lieutenant, James Harrington. Badly injured saving his men during training. Writes poetry of all things. Reminded me of father. Gave him the medallion. Told him to return it when he no longer needed its strength. I wonder if he will." The King placed the page down carefully. "There are other entries over the years. She wondered about you. Noticed when you joined the Royal Guard. Pointed you out to me once during a garden party, though we never spoke." Harrington felt a tightness in his throat. "I had no idea, sir. My mother was very good at seeing people, really seeing them, even in the briefest encounters." The King sighed. What you did today was technically a serious breach of protocol. Yes, sir, I understand that. But it was also the fulfillment of a promise, and my mother valued promises kept. The king turned to look out the window at the gathering darkness. The public seems to agree. He gestured to a television on the wall, which Wells promptly turned on. A news broadcast showed people gathering in Trafalgar Square. Many held candles. Some had small medallions, not exact replicas of Harrington's, but simple metal discs that caught the light. A hand-painted banner read, "For the Queen and her Guard." The scene switched to interviews with veterans, many in tears as they described what Harrington's gesture had meant to them. Then to hospital staff who had worked with the Queen over the years, sharing stories of her personal kindness that had never made headlines. "They're calling it the medallion effect," Wells explained, switching off the TV. "People sharing stories of personal connections with the Queen that went beyond her official role, the kind of stories that don't make it into history books, the woo." King turned back to face Harrington. "The palace has been flooded with calls and messages. The public reaction is unexpected." "I never intended to cause a scene, Your Majesty," Harrington said. "I only wanted to keep my promise." "I know." The king was silent for a moment then. "The inquiry will proceed as required. There must be consequences for breaking protocol. The guard relies on discipline and tradition. However, I've requested that those consequences take a particular form." He nodded to Wells, who handed Harrington an envelope. "This contains new orders," the king explained. "You are being reassigned, not dismissed." Harrington opened the envelope with steady hands. The document inside was official, bearing the royal seal. As he read, his eyes widened slightly, the only break in his disciplined expression. "Windsor Castle, sir? Personal guard to the royal apartments? My mother's private quarters will be preserved for a time before being repurposed. You will oversee their security. You will also assist the royal archivists in cataloging her personal effects." The king's expression softened slightly. "She kept meticulous journals. There may be other mentions of a certain hospital visit and a young soldier poet." Harrington struggled to find words. This wasn't punishment. It was perhaps the greatest honor a guard in his position could receive. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I don't deserve this kindness." "It's not kindness, Captain. It's recognition of something my mother understood well. That behind every uniform, every title, every position, there are human connections that matter." The meeting concluded shortly after. As Harrington was escorted back to the car, Wells handed him a small box. "One more thing," the secretary said. "This was found among Her Majesty's personal items. She apparently kept it in her desk drawer." Inside the box was a small book with a worn leather cover. Harrington opened it to find poetry. Dozens of poems carefully cut from newspapers and literary magazines. His poems, published under a pen name over the years, collected by the Queen herself. On the drive back to his apartment, Harrington looked out at London's lights. At every major intersection, the digital billboards that normally displayed advertisements now showed a single image. The moment he had placed the medallion on the coffin, captured in perfect clarity. Beneath it, a simple message: duty, honor, humanity. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing with notifications. Fellow guards, old army friends, family members, all reaching out after seeing the news. He would answer them tomorrow. Tonight he needed time to process everything that had happened. As the car turned onto his street, he noticed something on his doorstep: flowers, dozens of them, with notes attached. And sitting among them, glinting in the streetlight, were small medallions, some made of metal, others clearly homemade from whatever materials people had available. The driver saw them too. "Looks like you've started something, Captain." Harrington nodded, speechless for once. He had expected disgrace, punishment, the end of his career. Instead, his small act of personal loyalty had resonated across the nation, reminding people that, even in the most formal institutions, humanity could shine through. As he gathered the flowers to take inside, Harrington noticed a young girl watching from a neighboring doorway. She stepped forward shyly, holding out a paper medallion she had clearly made herself, colored with gold crayon. My gran says you loved the queen for real, she said. Not just because she was the queen, but because she was kind to you. Harrington knelt to accept the child's gift. That's right, he said. Sometimes the person behind the crown is even more special than the crown itself. The girl nodded solemnly, then smiled. I'm going to make more medallions tomorrow, for all the people who were sad today. As Harrington finally entered his apartment, he placed the poetry book on his table and looked at the paper medallion in his hand. Tomorrow would bring formal inquiries, media attention, and the beginning of his new assignment. But tonight, he understood that in breaking one kind of protocol, he had honored something deeper, the human connection that exists beneath the surface of all our formal roles and titles. And somewhere, he liked to think, the queen was smiling.